Hello, how's everyone doing this week? I don't know what it's like where you're at, but it has been hot around here. Summer may not be here quite yet, but it is definitely poking its head through the window and jacking up the electric bill. It has not been conducive to trying to get anything done, let me tell you. But the subject of this week's video is a very interesting one to me, and hopefully it will be to you as well. And that extra intrigue over just a very meh game like last week's look at NBA All-Star Challenge has definitely helped me get over that hump and get this review done. But that's all getting ahead of myself. Hi, my name is Dave, and this is the Zilog and Moto channel, where I've decided that I don't want to just collect retro video games and store them on shelves that are apparently harder to find than the games itself these days. Seriously, go try to find a Billy bookshelf from IKEA or the individual extra shelves. You can't. They're all apparently stuck on cargo ships out in the middle of the ocean. Anyway, I don't want to just collect a bunch of old video games. I want to fully document that collection. The package the game comes in, the documentation, and then the game itself, and then share all of that with you, so that maybe you'll get some useful information about these games and their place in history, no matter how large or small. The focus of the channel is on 8 and 16-bit English language titles for Sega consoles, so that means eventually I'm going to cover everything from Alex Kidd in Miracle World for the Master System to Spider-Man Web of Fire for the 32X, and yes, I do consider 32X titles in scope due to the fact that the 32X relies on the Genesis, or Mega Drive depending on where you live. If that sort of all-encompassing look at these libraries sounds interesting to you, I'd recommend you subscribe, as it will let you know when new videos are uploaded, usually once a week, and it will possibly help other people know about the channel as well, so that maybe some other people can benefit from this information as well. And with that intro out of the way, let's get to this week's video, which is something of an oddity as far as this channel goes. Normally, every episode is dedicated to one game, but there have been some exceptions, like when I reviewed both versions of Great Soccer for the Master System in episode 24, Tetris and Darius for the Genesis Mini in episode 35, and then a few multi-cart Master System titles like Hang On and Safari Hunt, or Marksman Shooting and Trap Shooting in episodes 16 and 81 respectively. But in today's video, for the first time, I'll be looking at 3, count 'em, 1, 2, 3 games. There's a very good reason for this though, because even though each of these games may look a bit different on the outside and have different names, in reality, they're all pretty much the same game, which is why I've decided to put all of them into one video. And those games are James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, Heavyweight Champ, and George Foreman's KO Boxing, all for the Master System. I'm specifying that because Buster Douglas and George Foreman both had very different games released for the Genesis, and those titles don't have this same oddity, as the Genesis version of Buster Douglas is a renamed Sega port of Tato's arcade game Final Blow, and the Genesis version of George Foreman is an original effort from Acclaim and Beam Software. So how did all this work with technically 3 different games? What's really different between them? And are any of them any good and worth seeking out? I'll take a look at all these things, but first a look at the packages, and I'm going to apologize in advance if the camera work on this next section is bad, due to getting all 3 of the boxes in the shot. Here goes nothing. And here we have all 3 games that make up this boxing triumvirate. First, the original James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, then Heavyweight Champ, and finally George Foreman KO Boxing. And yes, this is an authentic copy of Buster Douglas. I picked it up about 2 years ago. I think I might have had some extra money saved up or something, and I saw a listing for it on eBay, so I dived on it, unsure of when I would have another chance to pick it up. And honestly, based on what I've seen for Master System titles at game conventions, that was probably the right decision, as to this day I've never seen another complete copy of this in person. Whereas Buster Douglas released exclusively in the United States, hence its extreme rarity, Heavyweight Champ and later George Foreman KO Boxing both got more standard releases, with both appearing in PAL regions and Brazil. All 3 of these are in great shape, no real blemishes to the outer covers anywhere, all 3 have hang tabs intact at the top of the cases, and the inner covers all look fantastic with no edge wear or fading. The insides all look great too, not perfect necessarily, but not beat up, as we'll see in a minute. Looking at the outer covers, it's interesting to me that we can see sort of 3 different eras or styles of covers. First, with Buster Douglas, it's one of the last games produced for the US Master System, and as such, it has the updated labeling that Sega used specifically to promote the Master System 2, and that's reflected down in the lower corner as well. For Heavyweight Champ, the PAL releases didn't get that specific marketing shift, as the Master System was still doing well, so Heavyweight Champ still looks like a traditional Master System release from the time, complete with the black block font for the title, the sports logo in the corner, and the plain blue Sega logo. Finally, with George Foreman coming last, it's got the updated Master System formatting, which is signified by the smaller cross-hatching in the background, graphics instead of text for the title, and the updated Sega logo with the addition of the Master System at the bottom to differentiate from Mega Drive releases. Flipping over the back, and the Sega releases both look fine, with Heavyweight Champ getting an additional screenshot, but at the cost of them being slightly smaller. I do enjoy how specifically on Buster Douglas there's a line of flavor text that emphasizes that he was the boxer who beat Mike Tyson, in an obvious dig at Nintendo. Also, for Heavyweight Champ, I've got to call foul at it stating that the game has 12 rounds. Yes, a boxing match can go up to 12 rounds, but this really should refer to the number of opponents you'll fight, which is only 5. Lastly, there's George Foreman, and this is a clear third-party job, as it looks awful. The flavor text is tinier than usual due to supporting 8 languages, and the screenshots are of poor quality and aren't even the Master System version. They are actually from the Game Gear release. Opening each up, and you'll see the original Buster Douglas manual in portrait mode, as was standard for US releases, and then the Heavyweight Champ manual, which is largely similar except the text has changed with any reference from Buster Douglas to Stevie Davis. And of course the formatting has been changed to support the 6 languages. Heavyweight Champ also came with a catalog for the Master System 2, and in an interesting turn, it includes a screenshot from Buster Douglas rather than Heavyweight Champ, but not for the version I have here, because this picture shows the game referring to J. Douglas rather than Buster. Maybe they just hadn't decided on the Stevie Davis name yet, who knows. For George Foreman, it looks like there's not 1 but 2 included epilepsy warnings, and then a good but very direct manual on how to play the game, but with very little extra information, like perhaps a section on the fighters you'll be facing, which led to a somewhat confusing occurrence when I played the game that I'll get more into in the review. Okay, those are the 3 packages. Let's get to the games themselves and try to unwind this mess. In reviewing these games, I'm going to group James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing and Heavyweight Champ together, and then discuss George Foreman's KO Boxing separately. The reason for this is because even though all 3 of these games get grouped together as the same game on the internet, in reality, only the first 2 really should get that designation. Whereas George Foreman runs some of the same underlying code, it actually has a lot of differences, hence why I'm giving it its own space. Having said that, let's probably answer the first question you might be thinking. If Buster Douglas and Heavyweight Champ are so similar, why 2 different releases? That's actually a really good question. I've read where some people surmise that this was somehow a licensing problem, and that perhaps Sega's use of the Buster Douglas name had expired by the time that Heavyweight Champ was set to hit the market in PAL regions, specifically with Buster Douglas releasing in late fall of 1990 and Heavyweight Champ not appearing until spring of 1991. And yes, it's possible that Sega didn't license the Buster Douglas name for use in non-North American regions, similar to Reggie Jackson Baseball becoming American Baseball and Walter Payton Football becoming American Pro Football. However, boxing is a little different. While sure, James Buster Douglas is an American from Columbus, Ohio, with him being the heavyweight champion of the world, he's going to have name recognition everywhere that Reggie Jackson and Walter Payton may not. Instead, I think what happened with the change in titles from Buster Douglas to Heavyweight Champ is very simple. On the night of October 25, 1990, at an event billed The Moment of Truth, a 24-0 Evander Real Deal Holyfield absolutely obliterated an obviously out-of-shape Douglas in Douglas's first title defense to win the heavyweight championship, by knocking out Douglas in the 3rd round. This defeat was so sound, Douglas ended up retiring to Cuba for 6 years before eventually attempting a comeback. Due to this loss, Sega was left with a boxing game that featured not just a guy that wasn't champion anymore, but someone who lost so convincingly that for a time it appeared they would never fight again. Not exactly someone who's going to sell a whole lot of video games for you. Also, the licensing thing doesn't really hold up, as the Genesis version of Buster Douglas was released in Europe at the same time without being renamed, which makes things even more confusing, as the Genesis already had an alternate version of Buster Douglas ready to go in the original Mega Drive Japanese version that was a direct port of the Taito arcade game Final Blow. Regardless of all that, Sega made the right decision with the PAL release to rename the game, and Sega technically already had not one but 2 arcade machines under the name Heavyweight Champ, which made the new name very fitting. Now that all that renaming discussion's out of the way, what actually is different between Buster Douglas and Heavyweight Champ besides the packaging? In short, not much. As best I can tell in playing through both games, I can only come up with 2 differences: the title screen and the fact that your name above your health bar says Buster or S. Davis, depending on the version. Other than that, the games are exactly the same. No other sprite work was changed, and even the endings are identical, as your character's name isn't mentioned anywhere in the text. Unless you're a collector, there's definitely no reason to seek out Buster Douglas instead of Heavyweight Champ if you want to just play the game, as Heavyweight Champ is plentiful and relatively inexpensive compared to Buster Douglas, much more in line with an average sports title. I've spent a long time discussing the situation with the game's release so far, and technically haven't even touched on the George Foreman version yet, but I haven't really discussed the actual game, so I should probably get on that. Buster Douglas, while being a different game from its Genesis counterpart, is actually somewhat similar in nature. Both games feature boxing from a 2D side view with one fighter on the left and the other on the right, and movement is limited to just left and right. Also, both games feature a list of 5 opponents to face off against that you have to take on in order to win and cement your legacy. Beyond those 2 things though, the Master System version at least attempts to have some depth, as opposed to the Genesis game, which always felt like a video game version of Rock'em Sock'em Robots to me. This is done with the addition of a stats feature. To start up the game, your boxer is 1 in 5 in 3 different statistics: power, recovery, and speed, and you have 3 super punches allotted to you. For each fight you win, you have the opportunity to gain more points depending on how you win the fight that can be allotted to each of those 4 categories. As you make your way through each of the 5 opponents, they'll get stronger in those same categories, requiring you to use some strategy in how you allocate those points, and giving you incentive to try to win as many as you can by fighting well and going for the knockout. I like this concept a lot, but I do have a small complaint about how they implemented it. For knockouts, you're awarded 3 points, technical knockouts 2, and then a decision only gets you 1. I understand why they did this, and only giving 1 point for a decision makes sense, but to me, a technical knockout and a knockout are the same thing, so it almost seems like you're being penalized for ending the fight as soon as possible. Along with the status upgrades, I thought the inclusion of the Super Punch system was a fun addition to the game. Boxing purists might not like it, but having the Super Punches adds some variety to the game without totally throwing off the balance of combat, as the Super Punches are actually more useful for moving your opponent across the screen rather than causing massive damage. Also, anytime you see your opponent charging their Super Punch meter, your level of play gets that much more intense knowing what's coming, and that it's in your best interest to try to avoid it however you can. The controls of the game are good in theory. Each of the buttons on the controller is dedicated to one of your hands, with the 1 button being used for the left hand and the 2 button being used for the right. This allows you to logically attempt to put combinations together by alternating attacks, and then you can attempt to block or dodge attacks by pressing on the D-pad without hitting any of the buttons. It's a good concept and about as good as you could do with only 2 buttons on a controller. However, in reality, the game is much simpler than that. If you load up on your power rating as soon as you're able, you should be able to walk through the competition pretty simply by using nothing more than your left jab and walking straight at your opponent, with the goal of hopefully getting them into the ropes where you can really wail on them by bouncing them off the ropes and then back into your punches. There's a classic line from the 2006 film Rocky Balboa where Rocky tells his son, "It ain't how hard you hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." And while that quote wasn't intended to describe what's going on here, I do think it's an apt description of the easiest way to get through the game. Like in many 8-bit titles, the graphics and sound fall behind the gameplay due to the limitations of the console. Buster Douglas on the Genesis wowed upon release, not because it was a good game necessarily, but because of its graphics, accurately representing Final Blow from the arcades, with huge sprites unlike anything else on home consoles at the time. The Master System game is a much more average title, with smaller sprites, less animation, and some unfortunate flicker that can occur when both boxers are trying to throw a punch at the same time. Honestly, I'd say the game doesn't really look any better than Rocky did, which is somewhat unfortunate, seeing as how Rocky came out 3 years before. Along with the graphics, the sound is just average, with some decent 8-bit music, but a bunch of white noise sound effects for punching and crowd noise. Now that I've pretty thoroughly discussed those two games, I think it's time to bring George Foreman's KO Boxing into the mix. At the release of the George Foreman edition of the game, Big George wasn't a champion, with George not having held a major championship for almost 20 years at that point. However, George was in the midst of a career renaissance that would eventually lead to him being champion again, and he had parlayed that popularity that went along with that to being a pitchman in all sorts of commercials and talk show appearances. This notoriety made George a good candidate to sell a boxing game, and Acclaim jumped on board. However, for a console like the Master System that was only viable in Europe and Brazil at the time, Acclaim apparently decided to instead license the Heavyweight Champ game engine from Sega, rather than put the resources into developing a full game that would never see light of day in the United States. The result is a game where I can totally understand why people consider it yet another iteration of Buster Douglas and Heavyweight Champ, but at the same time, it has some pretty significant changes. The most obvious change is that the game's graphics have gotten an overhaul. Overall, the display is lighter, and the HUD has been moved to completely be at the top portion of the screen, rather than having the Super Punch meter split out at the bottom. But the boxing portion of the screen remains about the same size as do the boxers. The arena has been redrawn slightly to add more detail, and the ring mat has been redrawn as well to give more texture and of course change the Sega logo to an Acclaim logo. The boxers have been updated very slightly, but the most major change is simply reconfiguring your character to look more like George Foreman, which isn't just reflected in the main game but also in between rounds in the shots of the boxers in their corners. In these shots, George is shown to be eating a hamburger as a call out to his unusual training methods and larger-than-life personality. I can't decide if I like this or not, as it doesn't really match the tone of the rest of the game, and it almost feels like it was something that was thrown in as just another thing to try to differentiate the game from Heavyweight Champ. Along with the graphics changes, there was also some changes made to the gameplay for reasons that I don't quite understand. First, rather than the fights being 12 rounds, they were shortened to 10. It's unlikely that any of the fights would end up going to either of those lengths, so I don't know why they felt the need to make this change, and from a pure boxing perspective, this is a downgrade, as it makes the game less realistic. Then, in a change that at first I applauded, the skill points awarded for winning a fight were increased by 1, so instead of getting 3 points for a knockout, you now got 4. I think this is a better setup because even if you did make the effort to get knockouts over TKOs previously, you still couldn't max out your attributes under the previous system before the final fight. However, there's a reason why they made this altercation, and it's related to perhaps the most confusing change that was made from the original game. In Buster Douglas / Heavyweight Champ, you fight 5 fictional boxers on the way to winning the championship. In George Foreman, along with altering the graphics, they decided to change the names of the fighters, which is fine, as again, they're fictional. It doesn't really matter what they're named. But along with putting in new fighters, they made the decision to only include 4 opponents in the game rather than 5. Now, if there was, say, 10 fighters in the game, like there was in Muhammad Ali Boxing from episode 103, then losing 1 fighter isn't a big deal. But when you effectively cut out 20% of the game, that's a bigger problem. This is why they decided to award more skill points for wins, because now you only had 3 fights to earn them. It's a huge head-scratcher to be sure, and I don't really get it. You're already reusing at least 75% of the code from the previous game, You really couldn't put in enough effort to keep the number of boxers the same? Yep, sounds like a claim. Playing and reviewing all three of these games this week has been an interesting experience. For James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing and Heavyweight Champ, I enjoyed playing through both, even though the game is pretty easy once you figure out the left jab strategy that I mentioned earlier. There's just something satisfying about knocking someone out, challenging or no, and then the following excitement of whether they'll get up or not. And I really like the strategy and risk-reward system the skill points brings to the table. However, due to the relatively short length and pretty mediocre sound effects, I can't award the game more than 2 stars. I'd rather play it than the Genesis version, but that's not really saying much. As far as George Foreman KO Boxing goes, it's definitely the worst of the bunch. While yes, overall it has better visuals of the other 2 titles, I actually prefer the HUD from the original game, with its super meter being at the bottom, and the less clunky top. And with the aforementioned removal of one of the fighters, it's just not as an appealing experience. As much as I would like to give it a lower rating than the other 2, I think it still qualifies as a 2-star, and I wouldn't go so far as to call it a bad game, just an extremely mediocre rehash of an already decent title. Definitely go with Heavyweight Champ if you have a choice. Okay, and that's this week's extra large look at the saga of James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing on the Master System through all of its iterations. Normally, I definitely prefer to be able to concentrate on just one game per video for a few reasons, but with the notoriety behind this game and its stupid price point on the resale market, I thought it was important to go ahead and cover all aspects of the game and its other versions in one place, as it might help someone who is curious about how one game ended up with 3 different titles, and maybe which one they should add to their collection. Tune in next week. Well, actually, honestly, it might not be next week. I've got a vacation coming up next week, and as a result, it may be a little bit before I upload a next review, but when that new video does get uploaded, it will be about a game that I've never played before, and a game that I actually mentioned previously in this video. I guess I'm just getting my fill of Master System sports titles right now. Think about subscribing if you want to know when that video finally gets uploaded, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.